네, 지금부터 왜 자유인가 북콘서트를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 박수 한번 치고 시작할까요? 네. 이번 행사는 자유주의 청년단체인 Students for Liberty Korea와 자유기업원이 공동으로 주관을 하는 행사이고요. 이 책의 편저자인 탐 팔머 박사를 모시고 강연을 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be back in Seoul my second time, and I look forward to future visits. My name is Tom. I'm 62 years old, and I've been involved in the movement for liberty for a long time, and I hope for a long time yet to come. There are many ways to think about the value of liberty. We can think about it through history, psychology, anthropology, art, sociology, economics. But I believe in starting with something a little simpler. How do we live our lives? And most people, every day, live according to libertarian principles. They don't hit other people when they don't like what they do. They don't kill other people just because they disagree. They don't take things from other people just because they want them. And they don't kidnap people and force them to cook their food or wash their dishes. Now, that principle has been studied by Steven Pinker of Harvard University, a very important book. Human beings are incorporating into their everyday life the ideas of libertarianism. And this process has been going on for a long time, where the people are becoming through time, less violent. That's the key principle. Human life is much less violent than in the past. So when talking about liberalism or libertarianism, I use the terms more or less the same, I like to start by talking about how people just live their lives. And one principle is everybody knows a lot about his or her own life and circumstances. Adults do not need a life boss to tell them what to do every day. And I should add something. I did spend 2 weeks in North Korea some years ago, and it was a terrible thing to see, because they teach people everything comes from the leader. Everything. It's as if they tried to turn the whole population into small children. But the fact is, every one of us is at least as wise and informed about our own lives as the politicians or the rulers. And there's an interesting principle for people who believe in democracy. They believe we are all wise enough to vote to choose the rulers, but they do not believe we are wise enough to choose what to eat or what to smoke or where to send our children to school. It's a contradiction. So the question I face is, why is it that people do not embrace with their minds the principles that they use to govern their lives? And I think the reason is people believe the state is magical. They believe in the Harry Potter world, but instead of calling them wizards, we call them presidents. They believe that the state has magic powers, that it can run the economy, and it organizes society. But libertarians understand there's a principle in French, le monde va de lui-même. It means the world runs itself. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to explain to people that the state is just made up of people. They're just like you and me. They're not Harry Potter magicians. And then one more difficult challenge that requires knowledge of economics and sociology. And that is to show that complex forms of social order can emerge on the basis of very simple rules. And this is deeply important because many people think a complex order requires a dictator, but it's the opposite. Dictatorships create chaos, and simple rules create order. So the fundamental principle of libertarianism is the presumption of liberty. The other side believes in the presumption of power. To give it a simple example, In a free society, you don't have to ask my permission if you want to sing a song or bake a cake for your daughter's birthday. But the socialist mentality says you need permission for everything. You have to show why you should be allowed to do it. So if you want to sing a song, you have to go to the Ministry of Music and get a permission. So the question is, where does the burden of proof lie? The libertarian says, if you are going to be restricted in your freedom, the burden of proof is on the one who wants to restrict you. For example, if you can show it will hurt another person, then you could be restricted. But the socialist says, no, you should show why you should be allowed to do it. And if you cannot prove it, you are forbidden. Or to put it one more way, in the free society, everything that is not forbidden is permitted. But in the socialist society, everything that is not permitted is forbidden. And there are three principles that work together to provide the foundations for free society: individual rights, spontaneous order, and the rule of law. When rights are well defined and legally defended, people create complex forms of social order. But it rests on the existence of a system of law. With no law, there's no freedom. And here let me digress for a moment to be critical of some people who think if we abolish the state, we will be free. I think that's a mistake. It is possible to have law without the state. We see it all around us in the world. But if you don't have law, you won't have freedom. So merely eliminating the state will not make a free society. Anyone who disagrees, I will buy a ticket to go to Somalia. But I'm careful, I'll only buy one way, because I don't think you'll need the return ticket. What we want is the rule of law that will support freedom. And these principles support each other like the three legs of this stool or tripod. And here's a very important principle that Professor Hayek articulated. The law does not seek to create a particular order. It only creates the framework for order. If the law tries to impose an order, it will probably fail. And that's why libertarians are unique, that we focus on principles, institutions, and processes. But the other views, socialism, nationalism, fascism, and so on, they think that you can choose the ends directly, the outcomes. We understand you cannot choose outcomes. You can only choose processes. And this is another way I think libertarianism is more scientific, because we don't believe in magic. And our focus is on the institutions of cooperation. What I mentioned, when rights are well defined, legally secure, and can be exchanged, you create complex forms of social cooperation. And even groups we think of as enemies can cooperate if they have the right institutions. Ukrainians and Russians, French and German, Koreans and Japanese, Americans and Canadians, even cats and dogs. And this is a very important principle. To create peace among nations, you need the institutions of freedom of trade. And then people see the other, not as the enemy, but as the potential partner in mutually beneficial exchange. And I think this is especially important today, as there is rising protectionism and nationalism. We need to promote free trade and liberalism as the antidote. So the great Chinese thinker Lao Tzu articulated these ideas very beautiful thousands of years ago. And I won't read it to you in extensive, but this idea of Wu Wei is very difficult to translate. It is usually translated as inactivity in English, which makes no sense. My Chinese friends, I do not speak Chinese, but my Chinese friends say it means active inactivity. that the purpose of government is to create the right rules and then step back and let the order emerge. Lao Tzu also said, to govern a great country is like frying a small fish. What he meant was if you are constantly poking it and sticking it with the fork, it won't be correct. Let it cook. It's a very memorable image of the interventionist state. Adam Smith said much the same thing over 2,000 years later. What he says is, if you want a society that is wealthy, you need three things. Peace, number one. He says easy taxes. It's a nice way of saying limited government. And a tolerable administration of justice, the rule of law. And he said, if you have that, the natural order is to generate prosperity. It will happen naturally. Governments that try to change that and to direct society will fail and will become tyrannies. And let me conclude thinking about the benefits of liberty. I talked about prosperity and peace and cooperation. There's one more that's very important, and that is the idea of dignity. Frederick Douglass, a great libertarian who fought to free millions of people, he said the number one thing was to live the life of a free person, to enjoy dignity. Our movement believes in a very important principle of freedom for everyone. One of my heroes, a Brazilian libertarian named Joaquim Nabuco, he said it very beautifully. He said to be a libertarian is to love the freedom of other people. Not only your own, but to love the freedom of other people also. So it was very moving when I was in Japan. The Japanese libertarians were working very hard to support the people in Hong Kong because they see their fight as their fight as well. Now, this is a familiar flag from American history, from the War for Independence. The snake says, "Don't step on me." But Students for Liberty has a better model. I really like this. Don't step on anyone. Well, that's a deep question. It's a deep question in law, social science, and psychology. The first thing to recognize is Locke is much more pluralistic about his understanding of property. He believes that property can be established in a number of different ways. So I'll say something critical about an old friend of mine, Murray Rothbard. Rothbard did not understand Locke. He said the Lockean theory requires you mix labor. It was a necessary condition. Locke never says that. He says only it is a sufficient condition in order to defeat the opponents of property. But property can emerge in many, many different ways, depending on the context. The property can emerge gradually, as it did in many institutions of the common law, but it can also be created by agreement. And I'll give the very important example of fisheries. So Iceland and New Zealand are two countries that receive a lot of income from fish. Property rights were not defined and they were overfishing. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And the solution was property rights. So the legislatures, the parliaments of the countries established a system that was understood to be fair. In the Icelandic case, they said, what was your share of the total catch in the last years? That's your share of the total allowable catch for the next year, in subsequent years. And that right could be bought and sold. It had the following consequence. It got rid of a lot of inefficient fishing boats because the good business people bought them from the bad ones. And second, when the property owners could set the total catch of fish, they did the opposite of what the socialists thought. The socialists thought they would make it infinite. In fact, they lowered it dramatically because they had a property right. And when you have property rights, the fish in the future have a value today. And the consequence was recovery of the fishing stocks in countries that instituted property. Those are good examples from your lifetime, so not from 1,000 years ago, but from very recently, of good property rights established that solved a big problem, and they were pioneered by libertarians. It's a difficult question to address for the following reason. First, one should take a scientific mentality and look at what is the long-term trend. In our contemporary day of 24-hour news cycles, most people think murders are going up in America, but they're not. The number has been going down in a society of 330 million people. But everyone you see is on your news screens in Korea. But if you look at the long trend, since 1993, these numbers have been declining. So it goes like this, up, down, and so on, but long-term fall. What is the solution to a problem that is in fact getting less bad year on year, not worse? Many times people promote something that's just symbolic. You have to do something. But there's no evidence that the things they promote would work. So if we look at societies and control for other variables, there's no connection between gun ownership and violence. Switzerland has high gun ownership. Czech Republic has high gun ownership. Very, very low crime rates. Honduras, they have total gun control and the highest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere, despite the most strict gun control laws. So there's one thing we do know, and here I feel very strong, we know would reduce violence and murder. But most people will not address it. It's to stop the war on drugs and legalize narcotics. We had the same experience with prohibition of alcohol in the United States. When alcohol was made illegal, the murder rate rose every year until 1933, when it was legalized, and the murder rate fell for 11 consecutive years. So people who really want to reduce violence, there's only one thing we know would work, and that's stop the war on drugs. However, the case that you mentioned, which was in the news here, is something I think rather new, and we need to think about how to respond. Effectively, people committing suicide on social media because they want likes and attention. And there I think we have a social problem in the United States. Almost all of these public shooters are angry, young, white men. They're not Muslims, contrary to what President Trump says. They're not Mexicans. They're people who vote for him. And they're angry. And effectively they commit suicide in public by killing a lot of people. That's a social problem that we need to think about, how to deal with this. One thing people are suggesting is don't mention their names, because you give them what they want, which is everyone to know who they were, that they were very angry. So I carry a firearm, I own firearms, and I'm not a threat to other people. But we do need to have a policy to
address crime intelligently and to do the things we know will work, and merely confiscating firearms will not. Mention one more thing. Why I'm worried about a kind of extreme right-wing rhetoric that is becoming more prominent. I think it has very dangerous consequences. When President Trump and far-right extremists talk about immigrants as invaders, they use this language, they're invading our country. And then some ideologues talk about physical removal of the invaders, is the language Hans Happy uses. We have found there are people who do that. The one in New Zealand who killed all those people, he quoted these texts. Physical removal of the invaders. The one in El Paso, Texas, who went and killed all the people at the shopping mall, same thing. And I think we should take that rhetoric seriously. It has consequences. And I think as libertarians we need to step up and say, voluntary immigrants are not invaders. They're not the enemy. And we should not physically remove them, because what that means is murder. And I think we need to respond to that very strongly. And finally, when politicians refer to other human beings as insects, animals, and they use a word that President Trump uses, infested. It's a very ugly word. It's a word you use for rats or cockroaches. When politics talks like that, terrible things are going to happen. And we need to say, our fellow human beings are not cockroaches. I think it's a really important point. That's hard to answer quickly because it's a really deep question. You asked a very important question. In a nutshell, I think a society that's free and orderly without a state is possible. It does not follow that eliminating the state will make that society. I think that's a mistake many people make. I mentioned Somalia. There's no state, but it's not a free society. You do not want to go there. The absence of the state is not the same as the presence of liberty. So how can we support the institutions that make possible voluntary, peaceful cooperation without the state? And I think we see it happening around us. The spontaneous ordering mechanisms that already exist. My view is we should be limiting government, reducing its arbitrary power, subjecting it to law, and moving in the direction of greater free society. At some point, maybe we can get rid of the state altogether. I'm very open-minded and I would be happy to do that. But I think it's a mistake when we say we are just against the state. I'm not. I'm in favor of liberty. When the state infringes liberty, I'm against that. But when the state creates the rule of law to protect liberty, I'm for that. So in Somalia or Afghanistan, if you can create a limited government that will actually protect people, it would be an improvement over the anarchy they have right now. They have a terrible anarchy there. A limited government, to give you a simple example, which would you rather live in? Kandahar in Afghanistan or Seoul, Korea?
Korea.
Yeah. It's much safer here. You have a government that does terrible things, but they also provide the law and protection. That's very important. So your job is to make the Korean government more limited, more just, less arbitrary power. And not to say we're just going to smash the state. I think that is a big mistake. What we want to do is to build the institutions of freedom, property, contract, the rule of law. So I think a stateless society is possible, a free stateless society. But you won't make a free society just by attacking the state. That's a mistake, in my opinion. And some people use this language. We want to just be against the state. And it has two negative consequences. It means we don't talk about the institutions we do want. And the second thing is, it associates us in the public mind with terrorists. They're against the state also. And so the statists call us enemies of the state and social order. And I think that's a big problem for us. We should make it clear what we favor is liberty and the rule of law. That's what we're in favor of. To say we're anti-state is not the same as saying we're pro-freedom, because terrorists are anti-state also. They just have a different outcome that they want. I want to thank you for really good and stimulating, thoughtful questions and discussion. All of these questions were deep and serious, and I don't have always the answer, right? That's for you to discover, because you'll be thinking about and working these for a long time. But I'm very impressed. These are deep questions that you raised. Thank you very much.